Good afternoon, my darlings. It is the 1st of May 2024 and the Mayhem madness starts today. Set up, I think, possibly by Criminoli or somebody else, I don't know, but I found out about it through Criminoli, and I thought I'd start off with The Rats by James Herbert, which is initially what I started off with right at the beginning of making my videos. Now, this edition is from July of 1976, and I was born in the April. I wish I could say it was my dad's copy, but unfortunately that went missing in my giant James Herbert collection when we moved into the current house that we're living in now. So I trawled the second-hand bookstores online and I found a copy, and I was so happy that I picked it up. And well, when this first came out it was worth 60p. I certainly paid a lot more than that for it, but then again, these type of books are getting harder and harder to find in reasonable condition, of course, and obviously they're going to go up in price. Oh, I wish I could have paid 60p for it. That would have been a steal. Well, everybody knows about The Rats. It's James Herbert's breakout novel. It's the first one that he got published, bless him. And it's just a ripping read. It's fantastic. It is so much fun. I mean, killer rats running around the streets of London. If you're bitten by them, you don't last more than 24 hours. And if they've not had their lunch, you're it, mate. Your dinner. So, it's got many vignettes, as we well know, and it's just so beautifully written. It really, really is, and it's a lot of fun. There's lots of lovely, beautiful characters in this book, but the one that gets me is right at the beginning, when we start to think that there might be a little bit of a problem, and it is Henry Guilfoyle. Well, we all know what happens to poor old Henry. He's slowly drinking himself to death, and he'd been a very successful salesman for the Midland Paper Company. That was until he started to fall for young Francis, who was his protege, and they ended up getting rather drunk at a bar that they went to, and went back to the hotel, and obviously things happened, and he just fell in love with Francis. And back in the day, that was frowned upon an awful lot. Things started to change at work, and people found out about it, and he just felt that he was picked on, was poor old Henry, and he left his employment. So sad. And when he left, all he did was drink and drink, and he worked in little places along the docks to basically try and get a little bit of money just so that he could purchase some more booze and you know, drink himself to death, because he didn't have anything else to live for, since Francis didn't want him and he was no longer employed where he was. On the night that poor old Henry meets his doom, he had been climbing through a crumbling window in a house of a slum clearance in London, and he just passed out with the booze. And hours later he wakes up with a big start, and his befogged mind registered something. He didn't know what it was, but it was a sharp pain in his left hand. He jerked his hand away up to his mouth and he heard something scuttle away. He threw the bottle after the sound. When he tasted blood on the back of his hand, it began to throb, and the taste of his own sticky blood made him retch. And he was terribly ill. And he leans over to be ill. And then he feels a pain again in his outstretched left hand, and he shrieked when he realised something was gnawing at the tendons. Now we're starting to understand what the book's really like. Urgh. And he pulled his hand to his face, but he felt something warm clinging to it, something very heavy. He tried to shake it away, but by now it had a firm grip. He pulled at the body with his other hand and felt brittle hair. Through his panic, he understood what held him in his monstrous grip. It was a rat, but it was big, very big. It could have been mistaken for a small dog. There was no growling, no long legs to kick his body, only what seemed to be razor-edged claws frantically beating on his lower arm. He tried to gain his feet again and felt more pain in his leg. He screamed. The blinding pain seemed to run up his leg to his very testicles. More teeth sank into his thigh. As he stood, he felt tiny feet running up the length of his body. He actually felt hot. Fetid breath as he looked down to see what could climb a man's body with such speed. Huge teeth that were meant for his throat sank into his cheek and tore away at the huge flap. His body poured blood now as he threshed around. Once he thought he'd found the door, but something heavy leapt up onto his back and pulled him forward onto the floor again. Rats! His mind screamed the word. Rats eating me alive! God, God, help me! Flesh was ripped away from the back of his neck. He couldn't rise now for the sheer weight of the writhing, furry vermin feeding from his body, drinking his blood. Shivers ran along his spine to his shocked brain. The dim shadows seemed to float before him. Then a redness ran across his vision. It was the redness of unbelievable pain. He couldn't see anymore. The rats had already eaten his eyes. Then he felt nothing, just a spreading sweetness over his body. He died with no thoughts on his mind, not even of the beloved, almost forgotten Francis. Just sweetness, not even pain. He was beyond that. The rats had had their fill of his body, but they were still hungry, so they searched for more food of the same kind. They had tasted their first human blood. Now, if that first chapter doesn't grab you by the throat and say, I need to read more, oh yes, you are going to love The Rats. It's full of beautiful vignettes all the way through. Some are quite horrific. There is a scene with a baby girl and a terrier dog, which is beyond brutal. but I believe it's necessary. That this book wasn't meant to be a cute read, it was meant to be a shocker, a proper pulp horror shocker. It's just, it doesn't spare you. If you've not read much horror, perhaps don't start with this. You might not sleep at night. Yeah, it is meant to be a true shocker of a horror. I mean, it's what got me hooked. Honestly, I read this when I was a very little girl. Yeah, I hadn't actually hit my teens when I read this, and I was absolutely hooked. You know, I'd gone from Enid Blyton to James Herbert, pretty much. You know, the famous five. Yeah, with John and George and Timmy the dog. I think I've got that right. I think I've got that right. And then I go on to James Herbert, and these are not cute little, you know, beautiful creatures. No, they're not. They're scary, scary rats. And I just remember reading it and just thinking to myself, my goodness me, this is a beautiful book. I love this book. I must have more. And that was it. I was absolutely hooked. And I've been a James Herbert fan ever since. And I love his work, and I do miss him so very much. I know I'm going to mention your name again, Alan, but he's also a fan of James Herbert. And for me, I thought the Mayhem, I would start with the rats, and I'll cover the other ones as we go through, because I have all of them. I've got the rats, the lair, domain, and also the graphic novel, The City, which I'll cover them all properly, because although I did them for Hackman Calendar, I don't feel as though I've given them the best that I could have. I mean, I'm going to read another little vignette out of here because it's just so fantastic. Dave Moody lounged against the wall of the dingy underground platform, occasionally tilting his head back and drinking from a carton of milk. I'm pissed off with this lark, he told himself, peering into the gloom of the colourless station. Seeing the same girl 3 times a week for 2 months now was a bit strong. Pictures Wednesday, club Saturday, telly Sunday, and now she wanted him to cut out his Friday night football. Some chance. It wasn't as though they were even engaged. But Jerry was becoming more and more possessive, laying down the law about his friends, finding fault in his clothes, picking him up on his language, and all this performance, running to catch his last train, racing down those treacherous steps of the Shadwell tube. A couple of times missing one and nearly breaking an ankle. He wouldn't mind, but he'd spent the whole evening groping and trying to get her worked up, but getting nowhere. And then, when it was time to go, she suddenly turned on and started getting fruity. His mates had told him she was a PT, prick teaser, but he hadn't believed them. In fact, he'd even belted one of them. Maybe I'll give her the shove next week, he said to himself, voicing his thoughts for extra assurance. He began to whistle, but it was funny how he looked forward to seeing her by the time Wednesday came around. He stopped whistling. She always looked good, always dressed smart. Her mother got on his nerves, but he rarely saw her. Her father was a lazy old bastard too. Not like his mum and dad. He got on well with his own parents. He always had a freshly ironed shirt for Saturday night, always a good hot dinner waiting for him after work, and the old man could always be tapped for a quid or two towards the end of the week. He supposed his being an only child had a lot to do with it. After his older brother had been knocked down and killed by a car 7 years ago, his parents had seemed to turn all their affection onto him. He didn't mind. He liked them. He could always bring his mates round for a party. His father would always chip in for the beer. His mother would always dance with the boys. The old man would even chat up the birds. No, they weren't like Jerry's parents, miserable old sods. His thoughts were interrupted by footsteps descending the long flight of stairs. A coloured station worker came into view and walked toward the other end of the platform, entering a door marked private. David's thoughts returned to his present situation. Where's the bloody train? For once he got down there early, only to be left hanging around in the gloom. Jerry would always come to the door with him to say good night, her passion becoming stronger as his thoughts of missing the last train became stronger. She finally let him go and wait at the door until he was out of sight. He nonchalantly turned and waved back at her 2 or 3 times, and she'd blow kisses. But as soon as they turned the corner, he was off like a shot. His lungs soon soared with the sudden exertion of running. He invariably arrived at the station with a painful stitch in his side, dashed through the barrier without paying, took the stairs 2 or 3 at a time, and was usually just in time to leap through the closing doors of the train. It was a good thing Jerry never heard his curses. If he wasn't in time, it meant a long walk home down a trouble-filled commercial road. There was always nearly a mob on some street corner or a perv lingering in a doorway. Dave wasn't chicken, but it was a drag. Something moving caught his eye. A dark shape was moving along between the tracks. He walked to the edge of the platform and peered down into the track, into the gloom. Nothing. Then he noticed the shape and stopped, realizing it must be a rat. He threw the empty milk carton to see if he could make it scamper back into the darkness of the tunnel, but it merely shrank beneath the electric rail. The boy looked up sharply as he heard noises coming from the dense black cave of the tunnel. Oh, I'd have run at this point, stitch on up. Ooh. It sounded like a rush of air, but not the sound caused by an approaching train. He glanced nervously back at the form lurking in beneath the track, and up again as the noise grew louder. Oh my God, at this point I would have proper legged it. Absolutely, I'd have legged it that. Oh wowee. I would not stood around looking to see what it was. Oh my goodness. He glanced nervously back at the form lurking in beneath the track and up again as the noise grew louder. As he did, hundreds, it seems, of small black bodies came pouring from the tunnel, some between the tracks, others up the ramp and along the platform. At this point, he turned and ran, even before he realised they were rats, much larger than normal and much faster. He reached the stairs, a long black river of vermin almost at his heels, and flew up them 3 at a time. He slipped once, but quickly regained his balance, grasping at the handrail by the side, pulling it to gain momentum, but a rat had raced ahead of him, and his next step was on its back, causing Dave to stumble once more. As his hand went to steady himself, sharp teeth snapped at his fingers. He shouted in fear, kicking out wildly, sending two of the bristling bodies back down over their backs to their companions. He lurched forwards, now weighed down by rats that had attached themselves to his clothes and his flesh. Ooh, old poor boy. He fell again, hitting the bridge of his nose on a sharp corner of his step, causing blood to spill down his face and onto his white long-collared shirt. He kicked and screamed, but they pulled him back down. Oh, they pulled him back down the stairs, rolling to the bottom with him, ripping his body, shaking him as though he were a toy doll. His screams echoed through the old station. He half rose, and before his senses blacked out completely, he cried for his mother. Errol Johnson pulled the door marked Private open and rushed out. He'd heard the screams and assumed someone had fallen down the long stairway to the platform. He knew it would happen someday. Those stairs were too badly lit. If he ever became station master, if coloureds ever became station masters, he'd clean it up and make it respectable station. Just because it wasn't used by many people didn't mean it shouldn't be badly kept. He stopped dead at the spectacle before him, his mouth hanging wide. Millions of rats swarming all over the station, and big ones, like those he'd seen in his own country, but even bigger. His mind didn't even stop to evaluate. He ran without looking back. There was only one place for him to go, the stairs being cut off by the struggling mass of vermin. Without hesitation, he ran down the ramp and into the dark womb of the tunnel. His fear drove him straight into the approaching train, mercifully killing before he was aware of death's presence. And that is the underground railway station. There's a lot more to read, but I won't do it because I want you to enjoy it. Oh my goodness me. I would get yourself a copy of this wonderful, wonderful book. And dare I say, sit down with it tonight. If you can get it on Kindle, I'm pretty sure you'll be able to get it on Kindle, if not an audio book. And I think that this would be a wonderful start to Mayhem. And Alan, I'm sure you've got a copy, and I'm sure you could do a little Mayhem video as well. That might be fun. So, what will I bring you tomorrow? A surprise. I will have a look in my horror collection and I will see which one I'm going to bring you. And until then, my darlings, let the mayhem of May begin. Happy readings, darlings, and enjoy.